Dr. Hatem is our third speaker. He just let me know that he's running a few minutes late. Our guests need to leave hard and fast at 5 p.m. Walking out the door. So we're going to respect their time, and we're going to get going. I'm going to read a short bio for each of them. Dr. Shari Huhndorf received her Ph.D. in Comparative Literature from NYU, and she is currently Professor of Native American Studies and Comparative Ethics, Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. Her research and teaching focuses on areas of interdisciplinary Native American studies, contemporary literary and visual culture, cultural studies, gender studies, and American studies. And then also we have Phenocia Bauerle, a member of the, forgive me if I mispronounce this, in the Apsalooka Nation. Thank you. Close. Apsalooka Nation is originally from Montana, and we'll talk about Montana. I was just there last week. And after receiving a BA in English and Literature from Montana State, she attended UC Berkeley, entering into a Ph.D. program in Education Department's Language, Literacy, Society, and Culture programming, studying heritage, language, and revitalization. Phenocia came to Berkeley from Montana State, where she coordinated the Diversity Awareness Office. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed guests. Each speaker will speak for approximately 20 minutes, and then Dr. Hatem will have some remarks, and if we have time, we will open it up for Q&A. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here and for your willingness to commit the time to learn the issues that are at play in the conflict at Standing Rock that go beyond the headlines, because there are certainly some issues that are pressing for Native communities that aren't making the mainstream news. So thank you for your willingness to learn. Phenocia and I just met to coordinate, and we thought we'd talk each about 15 to 20 minutes, and that I would begin by outlining some of the historical and political issues that are at the background of the Standing Rock conflict, and that I would then turn it over to Phenocia to talk about Standing Rock specifically and what the specific issues are there and what the needs are. We will leave some time for questions at the end, but if you would like to interrupt at any time to ask questions, we would welcome them. So Native communities within and beyond the U.S. confront a number of very pressing and quite dire issues. And these include things like poverty. So when we think about, okay, what's the poorest community in the United States, it's not found in some place like central LA or in somewhere in New York. The poorest community in the United States is on the Pine Ridge Reservation. At Pine Ridge, the life expectancy is about 48 years, and that's the lowest of any place in the Western Hemisphere except for Haiti, a little known fact. Police brutality is a major issue in communities. There's been a lot of political activism in recent years around police brutality in racialized communities. Few people know that Native people are more likely to be brutalized and killed by police than any other group. Same is true for sexual violence against Native women and so on. So these are major issues that Native people confront, but these issues rarely make the headlines. And even in activism around in racialized communities, these issues tend not to be recognized, or if they are recognized, they're kind of relegated to a footnote. So there's much to be said about why that's the case. We could talk for the entire hour about why. One clue comes from an often told anecdote by a journalist called Don Hewitt. And Don Hewitt is somebody who created the news show 60 Minutes. You've probably heard of it. It's been around for a very long time. And 60 Minutes, I don't know if this is still the case, but for many years it was the top-rated news show, and it maintained that position longer than any other show had in the past. And at some point, somebody, had an interview with Don Hewitt and said, well, what are the factors that explain your success? And he had a number of things that he described. But one of the points that he gave was never do stories about Native Americans. And he gave a lot of reasons for that, but one thing he said was that those stories are way too complicated, they're way too tragic, and no one will understand them, they don't get a viewership. he said some other things, like Native people speak too slowly, so, he said some awful things as part of this interview. But there is actually a valid point there, and that is that Native issues are very complicated. They're not the same as the issues that confront other racialized communities. They're issues that emerge from a distinct history. Native people throughout the Americas have experienced 500 years of colonization. That's not in the past. That history affects the political dynamics of the present day. And we can't understand conflicts, including the conflict at Standing Rock, without understanding that history. So given the kind of particularity of Native issues and the fact that they tend to be overlooked, why has the conflict at Standing Rock drawn so much attention? The major reason, of course, is that it taps into a lot of current anxieties surrounding environmental issues. So the debates that have been ongoing about fracking, about reliance on fossil fuels, about climate change, clean water, and so on, all come to bear on this political moment. And also the conversations that we've been having for a number of years surrounding environmental justice. So one of the things that you might know about the Dakota Access Pipeline was that the original plan for the pipeline was to route it near or through Bismarck, North Dakota, which is a community that's 90% white. So that community protested, and the energy company that's doing the development decided, well, they better not do that. And so they rerouted the pipeline to go near the Standing Rock Reservation. So that's clearly an environmental justice issue in which communities of color are the ones that disproportionately bear the effects of environmental degradation and destruction. So that's, from at least from my point of view, the reason that this conflict has gained the kind of national attention that other Native issues don't. And the concerns expressed by the Standing Rock Nation itself feed that sense that this is really an environmental issue. So they have a very legitimate concern about clean water. They've positioned themselves as protectors of the earth in ways that can be understood in environmentalist terms. But if we had more time, I could tell you why this is a very uneasy alliance, that there's a long history that places the environmental movement at odds with Native politics. And that history goes back to the 19th century when the environmentalist movement emerged, and it emerged through the creation of national parks. And guess whose lands those were? Those were Native lands. So that's the beginning of the environmentalist movement. Those tensions have continued to the present day. There are many, many issues in places where the environmentalist movement is at odds with and directly opposes Native issues. So this is a kind of uneasy alliance that's happening at this moment. If we think about the Standing Rock issue as only about environmental issues, as pressing as those are, we miss the issues that are most important for Native communities and the issues that are at the heart of Native politics. And there are two issues that cut across Native politics everywhere. And those issues are first land, and second political sovereignty. And I want to say a little bit about each of those. There are two things that differentiate Native Americans from other racialized people. And the first is that Native people are the original occupants of the land, and that every inch of land throughout the Americas was or is Native land. And when you think about that, the political implications are dramatic. So we are on Native land right now. We're on Ohlone territory. We are benefiting from the dispossession of the Ohlone people. There's much to be said about the history of the University of California and the founding of Native California and violence against Native Californians. There's a long story to be told there. That's an issue that is not just relevant in the past, but extends into the present, so that conflicts over land are ongoing even to this day throughout the Americas. Now, the history of occupation of the land, the fact that Native people have occupied these lands from time immemorial, is the basis for legal rights to land in the present. based on the common law doctrine of aboriginal title. This is a common law doctrine that's recognized in the United States and many other nations. In the United States, according to the laws of the United States, native title to land can only be alienated by Congress. So that means that, let's say Donald Trump wants to go buy the Standing Rock Reservation, he has $1 billion, whatever, he can't do it. That only Congress can acquire native lands. And it can do so only through two means. One is purchase, and the other is conquest. And the intent to alienate those lands, I'm taking these lands from native communities, must be clearly stated. The fact that native peoples have rights to these lands that continue into the present means that historically, that native people have been the primary barrier to the founding of colonial nation states, and the United States as a colonial nation state, and to the control of land in the present. So that the major imperative of colonization is and has always been dispossession. That governments throughout the Americas, historically and to the present day, aim primarily to take away native land so that they consider that their own land. And that this dynamic, this imperative to dispossess, is at the center of the relationship between native nations and the federal government. And it explains every law and policy that's been passed with regard to native people, and it even gives an explanation for how native people are racialized. So there's a scholar of colonial studies called Patrick Wolfe, and he has some very illuminating things to say about this. So he says, if you look at the history of racialization in the United States, said, black people represent labor. And so the forms of racialization of black people, like the one-drop rule, you have to have only one drop of African blood to be considered black, emerges from that fact that we need more black people to exploit their labor. Now, we can also say the same thing about native people. Native people represent land. And so the racialization of native people has taken place very differently. So the imperative is to get rid of them. So if we just think about laws with regard to blood, you have to have a lot of blood to be considered native blood, to be considered Native American. And that's in stark contrast to the way that the amount of blood you have to be considered black. And the reason for that is that imperative to eliminate native people. Now, dispossession historically has taken many forms. There have been wars of conquest. There have been processes that we would now call germ warfare. So, giving smallpox-infected blankets to tribes to, make everybody sick, and then they die. One instrument of dispossession is treaties. Now, treaties are legal negotiations and agreements between, and I'm going to come back to this term, between nations. They're government-to-government relationships or agreements. And they confer, among other things, rights to land. So when we think about the history of Native America, there's a long history of treaty making. It took place over about 100 years. The U.S. Congress ratified 371 treaties with Native nations. Between the War of Independence and 1871 is when the last treaty was signed. There's even a longer history if you consider the treaties that were made between the British Empire and Native nations. So there were 371 treaties ratified, and the treaties emerged from agreements that went something like this. There's some kind of conflict over land. Maybe there's a war between a Native nation or many nations together and the U.S. government, and there's some kind of negotiation at the conclusion of whatever conflict it is. And basically, Native communities agreed to give up, in most cases, most of their land in order to keep a smaller portion of their land forever. Okay, those are the terms of the treaties, that those lands will be Native lands forever. That's the term of all of the treaties, forever. 371 treaties made with Native nations, every single one of them have been broken by the U.S. government. There's a long history of treaty violations based on the discovery of resources. like gold, like oil. So we could spend many hours situating the Standing Rock conflict in that history. What happens when gold is discovered, when oil is discovered, when coal, minerals, whatever, on native land? What happens to those communities and what happens to the land? There's a long history there. Okay, so that was point one, rights to the land based on historical occupation. The second thing that distinguishes Native communities from other racialized people is their historical existence as culturally distinct, self-governing entities. And the term that we would use now is nations. Okay, so what that means is that when Europeans came to the Americas, they encountered thousands of distinct, self-governing communities, many of them very large communities. And they undertook, over the course of many centuries, negotiations, trade relationships, and so on with those communities on a government-to-government basis. And that history, which is enshrined, among other places, in US law, is the basis for contemporary legal and political rights for Native communities. And this is little understood, that Native communities in the United States have the status of nations. They have powers that other communities don't have. Those powers include things like taxation. They have, in many cases, their own justice systems. They have power to control community services like healthcare and education. This distinct legal status is the basis for casinos, something we're very familiar with in California. The treaties acknowledge this status. They don't confer the status, they acknowledge the status of distinct nationhood. So if one imperative of colonization has been dispossession, we need the land. The other imperative has been undercutting the sovereignty, the powers of self-determination of Native communities. And that's happened on gradual ways since about the 1830s. There was a pivotal series of Supreme Court decisions called the Marshall decisions that began to undercut Native sovereignty. And those efforts have continued to the present day. So that in the contemporary United States, Native communities that are recognized by the federal government have the oxymoronic status, and this is a legal term, of domestic dependent nations. And we could talk a lot about that as well, but basically, what that means is that Native communities have a political status that's higher than that of states, but lower than that of the federal government. So the federal government has power over Indian country, but the states are not supposed to have jurisdiction, although states have asserted jurisdiction. There's some contradictions there as well. So these facts mean, among other things, if we're to think about the implications, that Native America poses a challenge to the legitimacy and power of the United States in a way that no other racialized community does. So if you were to look at, people have created maps of unceded land, land that has not been native land that has not been legally ceded to the United States, which means by US law that's still native land, even though it isn't in practice. It's a lot of the United States. Native nations pose a challenge to the power of the federal government because they have their own distinct power. And if we look at the history of what's happened to Native people throughout 500 years of colonization, it's a very brutal history. The population decline is on average 98%. And that history of massacres, of genocide, of theft, undermines the notion that the United States is a fair and democratic nation, right? And the same is true of other nation states. So this is one reason, I would argue, that Native issues tend to be neglected. No one wants to acknowledge them because the implications are great. Okay, so now I'm going to turn just briefly for about 2 minutes to what all of this has to do with Standing Rock, and then I'll turn the floor over to Phenocia. Okay, so Standing Rock, the struggle at Standing Rock, among other things, is an assertion of treaty rights. So the Great Sioux Nation, which was really a kind of confederacy of a number of Sioux tribes, signed a treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, in 1851 with the federal government. That treaty was then revised in 1868 to establish the Great Sioux Reservation, which was very large. It spanned 7 states. It encompassed most of the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. In fact, the Great Sioux Nation is comprised of 3 groups, the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. And so North Dakota, South Dakota, just the naming tells you whose land it rightfully is and has always been. Subsequently, that treaty was broken, and the land through which the pipeline now goes was part of that treaty land, but has subsequently and illegally been acquired by private landowners in violation of the treaty. So in asserting those rights to the land that are off the reservation, but are part originally of the Great Sioux Reservation, the Standing Rock Sioux are asserting treaty rights. They're asserting their legal right to the land based on treaties. And they're also asserting their role as bearing responsibility for territory that's traditionally theirs. Treaties remain the law of the land. Congress says that. So there's a legal basis for this claim. And there's another legal basis, and that is that there is historical precedent for tribes to sue companies that are developing, whatever it is, off-reservation land, but if that development has a potential to affect tribal land, the development can be halted, and there's long legal precedent there too. So they're asserting treaty rights and legal rights to the land in taking the stand that they're taking. The other issue that they're asserting is political self-determination. So that act of asserting rights to the land involves asserting their rights as a self-governing political entity. The discourse of nationhood is all over the statements that they're making. That's the reason that discourse is there. That comes to bear on not only their assertion to land rights, but also to the fact that they've sued the Army Corps of Engineers for approving the, what's the term? Is it the easement? It's the easement, right? Without consultation. Because Standing Rock is a nation, they're required to, the Army Corps of Engineers is legally required to consult with that nation before entering into the agreement such as the one it has. So the conflict at Standing Rock is about many, many things. Beyond environmental issues, it's about different philosophical understandings of the land, about relationships between land and people, about the sacred. But from a Native perspective, it's fundamentally about these 2 rights that I've described: rights to the land, rights to self-government or sovereignty that are enshrined in federal Indian law.
I really appreciate how much got packed into what Shari just said, because I think one of the things that's revolutionary to me in this standoff is that outside of the sovereignty issue, that these tribes, specifically the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, establishing themselves as water protectors versus protesters, which I think is something those of you who've been following it have seen, is also reestablishing the right to a different worldview and really making that a political situation. So when I say that, I mean that Native worldviews, not unlike other indigenous worldviews across the world, often have very specific relationships with the land in that we are not in a hierarchical relationship. We are all parts of the same environment, which I think is very different from this Western worldview of hierarchy. So that those tribal members and people who have taken on this idea of being water protectors, it's their right to stand up and be keepers of the land versus this is our land and we have the right to decide what happens here. I mean, that is the language of sovereignty from the United States, but really what is going on the undercurrent is that they are reaffirming this right to have a worldview in opposition with what we are brought up to believe. So I kind of wanted to, for me, that is where some of this has been so powerful and it becomes so personal for Native people and Indigenous people across the world. So I think Can I just see a show of hands? How many of you have been following this online, sort of seeing what? So, excellent. So you probably have the understanding that this is the largest gathering not just in North America, but internationally, of indigenous people who are taking a stand on a particular issue. And I think it's not happenstance that it's the environment, right? Because across the world, indigenous people have been dealing with this for hundreds of years, but we are at a tipping point environmentally in the way that is affecting. So I also want to illuminate the fact that those folks who are organizing in Standing Rock are really very, very aware of this and trying to make it also be a call to environmental issues, not just to save the environment, but around those relationships between indigenous people and the environment. So for me, it's very close to the heart. Also, when I was introduced, I am from Montana, which is right near North and South Dakota, so these areas are, I think it resonates a little bit personally with me in just that my tribe also has fossil fuels and understanding the impacts that can have on communities. I think one thing that also is really important to highlight that is not lost on us is that this is not just an environmental fight. This is a fight against capitalism and some very, very particular economic situations that indigenous people all over the world face. And I think that's often pushed off in the popular media because it becomes environmental, right? You hear about this environmental fight. And I think one of the reasons in popular media, one of the main factors in this being able to be something that was followed is social media, right? And I think technology playing a huge role. So this is partially why, in my mind, this fight has garnered the attention it has in the past. This is not the biggest fight that's ever happened. This is not the most impactful fight that's ever happened with indigenous people. It's just social media and technology today has allowed alternate voices to get out as opposed to those major new media outlets that don't find Native American issues to have large viewerships. So I was going to talk a little bit about just some of the basics of what's going on at the camp. So for those of you who aren't totally aware, that you hear the camp, and there's actually several camps that are occupied by different people. So at this point in time, we're talking about thousands of people who are in this small area in North Dakota who've come and staged protests. So there is the major camp, the main camp that was first established is referred to as Sacred Stone Camp. I am not going to try to say it in Lakota because I do not speak Lakota well. And that was established in April of this year by a few people who recognized what this whole movement towards the pipeline meant. And they were trying to deal with some legal issues, these women, it was mostly women, just went out and started camping there in protest and saying, this is our land. What has grown over the summer, there is 2 other camps. One is Red Warrior Camp, and the other camps are across the river. So they're made up of different folks. There's, let's see. So the Sacred Stone is the major camp. It's the biggest camp. That is where many of the people who come who are supporters but of not all Native will be asked to stay if you stay there. There is the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has their own camp, and that is really primarily for Native folks, particularly those who are helping to organize around those issues. Not that it's a keep out, but they're really trying to, you're dealing with like 3 small towns that are all, there's no government. There are people who are leaders, but that has, in some of the camps, that's changed over the last few months in who are the main players in that. And then Red Warrior Camp is a camp that is a bunch of different people who are allies, many who come for the environmental reason. These are environmentalists. And that camp has been a little bit more, shall we say, politically active in certain ways. And all of these camps work together in different ways, but they're not all organized together. So what the Standing Rock Sioux Tribes camp is focusing on really is the peaceful protest and occupying the land and keeping people there so that it's a statement. It really becomes the political statement, and the focus is really on peaceful protest and occupation. The Sacred Stone Camp, the largest, which has become where most folks are staying, it's where they have the school. Some of you might have heard they established their own school over the summer because people moved there actually to live and recognize the opportunity. I would say it's more opportunity than need to educate their children about this historic event and really reconnect and assert rights in a particular way. So what came out of that was teaching Lakota language, teaching about the water, restoring a very specific cultural worldview there. And so that's where a lot of people are that are there in and out. There's medic tents, medic little mini camps set up in each place. Each place has its own legal fund. I mean, so you're really talking about three movements that are uniting for one, but they're for different reasons. And I think Shari covered some of that. Some of it is about sovereignty. Then there are environmentalists who come in and really want to support, but aren't so much there about defending the sovereignty. So I think that's really important to understand because it's things that get glossed over when you're reading about it. And then there was a fourth camp that was established probably when some of you were able to start following it, because it really escalated when there were dog attacks last month, and some of the protesters were bitten by dogs when they first started pepper spraying people. They had determined they would establish what they called treaty camp, very specifically for the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, in an area of unceded land. So it technically still belongs to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, but it was directly in the way of the pipeline. So in order for that pipeline to continue drilling or to be laid, it would have to go through the camp. Now that was the first camp that was forcibly taken down a few weeks ago, where all of the militarized police came in and literally pulled people out of their tents and out of ceremony and forcibly removed them, and then tear gassed them back, pepper sprayed them out of that area. So that fourth camp was disbanded, and actually they've laid the pipeline already through there. So I think it's also important to understand the pipeline is being laid incredibly fast. When you talk about this event that happened 2.5 weeks ago at Treaty Camp, that's already done now. They are moving as fast as they can because they're already behind schedule. And so they are planning, according to Energy Transfer Partners, which is the company taking care of this, to drill under the river, which is the big issue, over Thanksgiving. So next week is when they're on schedule to do that, even though the easement hasn't been granted. Now, I think it's important to note that initially the Army Air Corps or Army engineers asked Energy Transfer Partners to stop. Not said you have to stop while we figure this out. If you could just stop drilling or stop laying your pipeline while we figure this out. And they don't have to. So they asked them again, and they have not. And now they've said they have to halt, and Energy Transfer Partners have said they will not. They will continue to dig because they're quite certain it's going to happen. But the protesters, the water protectors are still there. At this point, there are different ways that people are going to help out. But I think it's important, if you're thinking about going, to really consider why you're going and how you can be of help. I think it's great that there are people who go. I mean, I think last weekend they said they had an influx of 2,000 people into the camps. So that's amazing on one hand and very taxing on the other for these camps where they're saying come be as self-sufficient as possible, which is great if you can be, but just if you think on basic needs, porta potties, places to go to the bathroom, how many people and the tax it could put on a small community like that. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to go, but really weigh what your contribution can be. And I mean, I think it's wonderful. This is a historic moment, so to be part of that, but also looking at how you can assist. It's an incredible amount of food. They will feed as many people as they can. And I mean, their first priority always is the people who are on the front lines, who go out and do peaceful protest, prayers on the front lines to really show that they are in opposition to this. But from what I understand, it's an amazing experience, but also one that should be entered into thoughtfully in terms of how you plan on giving back. And I'll say this now in case I forget, but I have several documents that sort of are tips for folks who are going, and I can share that for people who are interested in that, things to think about if you are camping, if you are, how you might think about volunteering. Right now, from my understanding, a huge need is for medics, or medical help, even volunteering in the medic tents, because as there are standoffs, the pepper spray is tough on people. There are minor contusions, things like that happen that people just need help with. So those were some details. I think I guess at this point, I would ask for questions.
Maybe we could take questions. I know, Shari, you're going to leave at 5, or if you want to leave at 5. So let's take some questions for both, and then I'll do some summary before we break for the end. So let's take some questions. While you're getting the microphone, first let me thank both Shari and Phenocia for being here. Now, I would like to say that Zaytuna is open to you at any time. We are living on indigenous land, so this is your home and your house. Anytime you want to do anything with us, with Zaytuna, this place is yours. And this is something we offer as a way to express our solidarity. So.
And I would like to reciprocate, just representing the Department of Ethnic Studies, which you are part of.
Sure.
So we are already together in some way, that we have 4 dark years ahead, and that our space is open to you as well, and we look forward to other opportunities to work together.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for being here. It's really an honor to hear from you all, your perspectives on what's happening. Last spring, some of us went to Selma, Alabama, and learned about all the things that happened there, especially on Bloody Sunday. And one of the things that stuck out to me there is that many of the police officers were actually members of I want to say KKK or white nationalist groups or something like that. I'm wondering if there's any insight into the ideologies of the police that are involved at Standing Rock now. And I ask the question because I wonder if anyone has tried to organize either the pipeline workers or the police to go on strike or to join the water protectors. I feel like there's often this dichotomy of us versus them, and we're good and you're evil, and that's what the other side thinks too. But really, it's about humanity and life, and the police are alive and the workers are alive, and there's some principle of life in them. I hope that will speak to the tragedy that's happening. So I wonder if an approach of asking them to strike could work, and if not, why not? Or just an idea.
I do know that there has been a number of efforts to organize different unions in opposition to this, saying that if this happens, there would be a strike, because there's, outside of the humanity issue is beautiful, and I think that's the right way to look at it. It addresses the economics of, you could have this pipeline without having people to actually do it. I think I haven't heard specifically of organizing police officers to strike. I do know that after some of the more gruesome incidents that happened, the intensity, that some officers, because they're pulling officers from different states. It's not just, it's National Guard, but it's also officers from Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Minnesota has pulled their officers that they sent. Montana has pulled their officers that they sent based on people calling their governments and saying, we don't support our officers going. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been officer strikes yet.
I'll just say a few words for context, and Phenocia, you can correct me because I have never actually been to the Plains. I'm from Alaska, and I often think of the Dakotas in particular as being somewhat like Alaska politically, because this is a place where, unlike California, this is a place where racism against Native people is very much on the surface and is very much the kind of dominant attitude. And my sense is, just from having grown up in the place where I grew up in, that that must be very much shaping the police attitudes and the police actions in this context. And that if this were playing out somewhere else, where maybe attitudes towards Native people are more complicated, that, some kind of police solidarity on behalf of the activists or the protectors might be more possible than it is there. So.
Yes. Yes, those areas, I think, outside of reservations, which are largely Native, you have border towns, which are some of the most racist areas in those states that you will get to, because it is such a racial divide where things that we think in this country are not, don't happen anymore, are relics of the 50s and maybe, pre-civil rights really happen. In a place in Montana very similar to Bismarck where this is happening. I grew up and I remember having to wait to be seated in restaurants if a white family walked in after you. So, and that is the status quo. So there is this very real dehumanization of Native peoples, and a very entitled attitude of telling Natives that there are more important things to worry about. This is not something you should worry about. Shouldn't you worry about poverty? This is not something you should worry about. So I think those two things really do play into it in a very real way.
Thank you both for your wonderful presentation. I think this is a good follow-up question to what you just mentioned, if a little bit redundant. One of the themes that have been a recurring theme is the theme of dogs. This whole situation was brought into our attention when, dogs were unleashed on Native Americans. And just this morning, before I left my home, I heard Amy Goodman talking about how Native American protesters have been put inside dog kennels for half a day, all day. So there's a quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill, and I just wanted you to put things in perspective for us. He said, "I do not agree that a dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that a right, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the degradation and the humiliation that's taking place even today in light of the historical context. Thank you.
I couldn't hear clearly what you were, the last part.
I guess what I'm looking for is perhaps maybe the speakers can touch a little bit on the aspect of degradation, dehumanization that's taking place in light of the greater historical context.
So in this place in particular, or with
as it
regard
is
to
happening
Native,
today
or with regard to Native communities?
to Native communities in particular?
Anywhere. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. I touched on that a little bit, just in passing at the beginning of my presentation. And we might think about things like, again, poverty, and that poverty isn't accidental. I mean, there has been a kind of deliberate destruction of the means of subsistence and economic sustenance that Native communities would depend on. So it's a deliberate kind of disempowerment and impoverishment that leads to kind of social despair. Really, again, widespread violence against Native people. That's always been the case. It still is. I mean, places like the Dakotas and where I'm from, there's violence on the street. Native people are vulnerable walking down the street. Native people are attacked by police more than anyone else. Native women are assaulted more than anyone else. So, there's the kind of big issues of the way that communities are oppressed and disempowered and so on. And there's also the kind of daily violence that individuals experience walking down the street in schools and so on. So it's, it's an entire spectrum. And what's happening to the protectors there is just part of this bigger picture. Dogs being sicked on them. And, I haven't looked up what the local press coverage is, but I imagine it's awful. I imagine it's very, very hateful.
Yeah, I think your quote really resonates with what's going on. But again, it does just follow this history of dehumanization. I think one of the things that's important to remember that this is just harkening back to is the reason these lands were originally taken, particularly in these areas that were some of the last areas to be colonized and taken over, is because people didn't know what to do with that land. It wasn't of use, and it's never taken until it's of use or of value to the people who are colonizing or moving in. And so the idea that they're not doing anything with it. These people can be occupying this land, but they don't know what it's good for. And as soon as people come in and know that economic gain can be taken from it, then that makes it valuable. And you didn't know any better, you didn't do anything with it, so that makes you just forfeited your right to say you own the land, versus the Native perspective of we never own this land, and it is extremely valuable, which is why we're not doing anything with it. Like, this is our world. Why would we degrade it? Why would we break it down? This is what sustains us. And I think that's really, you have a clash of two very, very different worldviews, and one is just more widely accepted than the other. So and we see this all over the world, right? Anytime the more powerful body sees no use in something, they will use violence, they will use dehumanization as an excuse to take away, right? Particularly where race is concerned, but it happens nationalistically, ethnically. So I think that quote was really, really painful, but also accurate in what's going on.
Native rights to the land are particularly threatening to the powers that be, right? So there's a Native writer called Craig Womack whom I often quote, and he has this sort of wonderful passage that says, "America loves Indian culture, but is not so crazy about Indian land title." And conflicts over land always incite violence, and that's always been the case, and it still is. I grew up in the land claims era in Alaska, and my family was very involved in that, and there were many years when I was a child when my father would not leave the house without a bulletproof vest. And he wasn't the only one, because people had to be very afraid. And that's still the case. I mean, that's the case now. So yeah, I think it's an apt quote. Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, it seems that there's nothing legal about this entire process. There's nothing within the law that would allow this pipeline to continue to be built. So I guess if you could explain, so why are the police officers coming in and moving people like that? Like, what gives them the right? It doesn't seem to make any sense.
Okay, so this is treaty land, and the terms of the treaty explicitly were that lands that were pledged to Native people would be theirs forever. You know, Congress has affirmed that treaties are the law of the land, but nevertheless, that process that I talked about where the federal government has gradually undermined sovereignty and claimed its power, legal and political power over Indian country, has said, according to the federal government, that that gives them the right to break the terms of the treaties. So the federal government might say, we have the right to do this, but according to the treaties and the laws that are on the books, they do not. So, you know, the courts are American courts. They're going to hold for the government. It's a question of power. It's not right, it's not legally right, but it's an issue of power.
And I think what's important also to understand is it's sort of status quo. This land that is happening, people think of the only land that's Indian land out, because treaties, people don't even think about treaties. You think about reservations, right? That's what belongs to the tribe. And so this pipeline doesn't directly cross the reservation, which is why this is a very complex issue in how they being Energy Transfer Partners went about consulting with the tribe. It was at the very end, after they had purchased different parcels of land from personal property, so individuals who owned that, and they did it in small installments. So by the time they had already started laying the pipeline, had the route determined, then they went to the tribe and said, oh, by the way, this year, this is crossing through, it's gonna be near you, it's across the river, so if there is a leak, it will affect the tribe, but it's not over tribal land, so what do you think about that? And this is one of the lawsuits that the tribe is having against Energy Transfer Partners, is that the process for consulting wasn't consulting. It was done very last minute, in haste, essentially just letting them know this is what's happening, and wasn't responsive to requests for discussion about rerouting anything. So I think it's not. This is why this is very important that they're calling back to treaty lands, to the treaties and saying this needs to be looked at. But because the way that they went about getting this pipeline started and all of the easements up to now granted was because it was private land, and there were different, some was state, and you can only do certain things on state land. But it was very different. If some of you remember the Keystone Access Pipeline a few years ago that got shut down, this company learned a lot from the reasons that pipeline got shut down, and really used other methods so that you didn't have to do, it didn't cross enough land to need EPA to look at it, because it was done in these small sections and approved in small sections, not in a huge one pipeline. So yes, it is illegal, but there's always loopholes.
This relationship in terms of solidarity with Native communities, it's a long-term relationship, that this is a building process. There will be many opportunities to continue to express that. You're going to go there and learn, but there's many Native communities in this area as well, that we need to link up with them and see what are the possibilities and which way we could express the solidarity to make the world different. We are all here treading on Native lands, and that has to be in your consciousness every time you step, to understand the meaning of what does it translate to if you're walking and you don't have that consciousness. And I know we want to struggle about causes far and near without realizing this fundamental piece in relations to the land that we are in. This is 1492. So we're talking about a long-term struggle of dispossession, and 98% of the Native population have been completely committed to genocide. And just for us to realize that we have what's remaining is about 2% of that population. And that has to weigh heavily on us in this period of time, and also as we think in transnational perspective. I know that some of us from Zaytuna are going. I know some MSA from Berkeley are going, so we have some Berkeley students as well are going. So we can, when you come back, that's where the real work actually begins. as you learn and you understand what is taking place, come back and begin the work in order to change the conditions both here and across the country, but also hopefully across the world. So really thank you, Shari, and thank you, Phenocia, for being with us, for accepting our invitation, and for coming here. And again, this is your home, and feel free to ask and call on us for anything that you need to be done.
Well, thanks again for the invitation, and thanks for being here, and look forward to future conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.